Today's lecture is going to deal with some questions related to epistemology and how different ancient thinkers' epistemologies related to their ideas about science. So, what is epistemology? It's the branch of philosophy that deals with how we know the things we know and what it means to have knowledge. As such, it's one of the oldest and broadest branches of philosophy. So in this lecture, I'll be giving a brief overview of some different models of knowledge in Greek philosophy. For some of you who study ancient philosophy, this may be very familiar, so I apologise for that. Then I'll get a bit more specifically into what this means for scientific knowledge, particularly in the cases of Plato and Aristotle, including some discussion of Aristotle's logic. Then in the last part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about scepticism, the earlier scepticism of the Eleatic skeptics, and I mentioned them a bit last week. And that will include some stuff on Parmenides and Zeno. Chronologically, this means this puts this lecture a bit backwards because I'm going to be talking about Plato and Aristotle first, and then the Eleatic skeptics second, even though they came before. But conceptually, this is probably the best way to introduce this. And many of the issues I'll be touching on today will crop up next week in the lecture on cosmology. So, let's begin with knowledge. In everyday language, we use a variety of terms for our cognition and thinking about the world. Some of the terms we use encode claims both about our own commitments and about truth. Saying that you think something is not really the same as saying you believe something, which implies a commitment to it, or you know it, which usually means that you're making a certain claim about its truth. Now, there's no exact linguistic mapping from the English terms think, know, and believe to Greek terms, and the concepts don't align particularly well. To add to some of that complication, much of our modern notions about knowing and believing, at least in the Anglophone world, have been quite influenced by 20th century philosophy. Many 20th century philosophers writing in English distinguish between three different types of knowledge in a way that's influenced both research on ancient philosophy and everyday notions. And these are certainly types of knowing that I recognised in my everyday notions, and they may be familiar to you. So the distinctions that many philosophers drew, in particular A.J. Ayer, but others following him, they were as follows. So between one type of knowledge that is often referred to as knowledge that, so this is kind of propositional knowledge. I know that a square has four sides. I know that London is the capital of the UK. Second type of knowledge is often called knowledge how. That's things like, I know how to replace a bike tyre, or I know how to swim. And the third type is often referred to as knowledge by acquaintance. For example, I know Paula quite well. On these grounds, some people have argued that Greek philosophy also had a similar distinction. It had a version of this same distinction between the three different types of knowing, and sometimes people point to the three commonly used Greek verbs of knowing. Those are gignoske, eidenai, and epistathai. So it's sometimes claimed that those three follow this distinction. Epistathai is knowledge that, gignosken is knowledge by acquaintance, and eidenai kind of doesn't really fit in either. It's kind of neither knowledge how nor knowledge by acquaintance nor knowledge that. But Miles, Berniat and others argued sort of from the 80s onwards that this doesn't actually really reflect the real use of the terms. And when you look at it, it's a lot more complicated. The Greek nouns most commonly used for knowledge include episteme, which is used quite often to mean something like demonstrative knowledge, and you can see why people take knowledge that to apply to that. Another commonly used one is noesis, which is sort of something like cognition or intellection. And then another one is gnosis, which is often translated something like recognition. It's often got this connotation of knowledge by acquaintance, but it's actually also used just to mean knowledge in quite a neutral sense. In later texts, especially once you get into Hellenistic Jewish and Christian texts, it starts to mean something like revealed knowledge. But among kind of classical writers, it's often used in quite a neutral way. There's also the term tekne, which is used, of course, to mean craft or skill, but is sometimes used to mean technical knowledge. There's also a set of related terms which we take to refer to other cognitive faculties, but the boundaries are not super clear. So pistis is the most common for belief or faith. Other terms include dianoia, which is often used for something like understanding, doxa, which is used for opinion or kind of received wisdom. And as you can see, there's quite a range. For many modern people, it's natural to think of knowledge as a specialised type of belief. Indeed, many contemporary philosophers also think of knowledge in this way. Most contemporary philosophers working on knowledge are less interested in concepts of knowledge how or knowledge by acquaintance, that is, statements like I know how to ride a bike or I know Jason. They deal primarily with questions of propositional knowledge, that's knowledge that, statements of the form S knows that P, or just S knows P. In these kinds of propositional analyses of knowledge, a model regularly referred to among contemporary philosophers is the standard analysis, which is sometimes also referred to as JTB, justified true belief analysis. And that's a mid-20th century philosophical analysis which defines knowledge as justified true belief. So knowledge is a kind of belief, but what marks it out from other kinds of belief is not only that it's true, but also that it's justified. What exactly it means for a belief to be justified is the subject of a lot of debate, and that forms the core of most objections to JTB, and most contemporary philosophers don't accept JTB. Most contemporary philosophers do accept the claim that knowledge must be true to be knowledge. And also most contemporary philosophers accept the claim that knowledge is a specialised kind of belief. That's to say, under the majority of contemporary epistemological models, a belief that meets a certain set of conditions is in fact a piece of knowledge. In the case of the justified true belief analysis, this happens when a belief meets the criterion of truth and the criterion of justification. Many contemporary philosophers would set slightly different conditions on this, but essentially the point I want you to take away is that a lot of contemporary epistemology that talks about what it means for something to be a piece of knowledge set the condition that knowledge is a kind of belief which meets various criteria. In much of ancient Greek philosophy, belief and knowledge were conceptualized as different types of cognition. Some philosophers, including some Stoics, did make the case that some things could be the subject both of belief and of knowledge, but no major Greek philosophical tradition posited the widespread contemporary view that belief can be converted into knowledge by meeting certain criteria. In most cases, ancient philosophers explicitly delimited the subjects of belief and knowledge as separate. I'll turn now to a couple of examples of this. So this is important for thinking about the background, the epistemological background of science, that people don't think it's just a belief that's been upgraded. And I'll work through a couple of examples now in the next section. So let's start with Plato. Plato talks about knowledge in various places in his works. In the Theaetetus, he rejects three possible definitions of knowledge. The first of these definitions that he rejects is to say knowledge is sense perception, aesthesis. So whatever you perceive, you know that. The second definition he rejects is knowledge is simply true belief. If you have a true belief, that counts as a piece of knowledge. The third definition is true belief plus an account of why that belief is true. The word account there is logos, and you can see there the similarities with the JTB or justified true belief account in contemporary philosophy. Instead, Plato takes knowledge to be something else. He says that it's a mental state distinct from belief, and he elaborates on this a bit more in the Republic. So in the Republic, Plato's theory of knowledge is expanded considerably and is explained using an analogy that has come to be referred to as the analogy of the divided line. So the analogy of the divided line. In that analogy, different types of cognition fall along a spectrum, that's the line, which is divided in the middle into infallible types of cognition on one side and fallible types that can be proved wrong on the other. The spectrum has four categories, which from the least reliable to the most reliable are imagination, eikasia, belief, pistis, and now into the infallible, understanding, dianoia, and knowledge, noesis. And note that he's using the term noesis there, he's not using episteme, which is the most common word for knowledge. He does use the word episteme. Sometimes he means both dianoia and noesis. Sometimes he means something else. But for that very highest category of real, true knowledge, he always uses the term noesis. So for the Platonists, the highest category, noesis, applies only to the intelligible world of the forms, and in the next bit of the lecture I'll come back to what that means. For the next rung down, understanding covers the intermediates, and that includes mathematical objects and many types of what we would think of as scientific knowledge. The two top categories, knowledge and understanding, are distinct from the bottom two, hence the divided line, in being infallible. While a particular opinion, a doxa, which falls under the bottom half, so it could be imagination or it could be a belief, it may be true and it may be incorrigible. Incorrigible simply means that you can't be proved wrong about it. So for example, if you say, I'm looking at the sky and I see the sky as red, no one can correct you on that, but that may nevertheless not be true. So it may be incorrigible, but it's not infallible. It's not what we would think of as knowledge. As can be seen from this short summary, attaining true knowledge noesis for Plato is a really high bar. While he doesn't believe that attaining knowledge is impossible, functionally speaking, the bar is set so high that human beings may well not actually reach it, and that human beings, the kind of highest form of knowledge that we functionally encounter in real life might be dianoia, the second category down. So if noesis, this highest category, is just of the form, what does that mean? So these different categories of cognition, true knowledge is just of the forms. Well, I mentioned the forms in my first lecture, and my mention then was a bit about Plato's anthropology, the idea that people are imbued with a divine part, and it's through this that they recognise the forms. But that's primarily an epistemological statement. So what actually are the forms? What's going on here? And again, if you've done much ancient philosophy, this will be very familiar territory, but in case anyone hasn't, I am going to go into it. So the forms crop up in various places in Plato's work. One of the best known instances in what's known as the allegory of the cave, and this is probably the most famous bit of Plato's philosophy. So the allegory of the cave is in the Republic at 514a. It's important to understand the context of it in that discussion. So it comes just before the analogy of the divided line that we've just talked about, so it's within this discussion of epistemology. And it comes just after another linked allegory known as the analogy of the sun. The analogy of the sun is kind of both an epistemological thing and an ontological analogy. It's talking about not only about how we know things, but also about what exists. In particular, the analogy of the sun is the way in which Plato links some of his ethical theory, the question of what's good, with his epistemology. The analogy goes like this, and I quote, "As goodness stands in the intelligible realm to intelligence and the things we know, so the sun stands in the visible realm to sight and the things we see." So as you can see, it's a kind of classical analogy. That's Republic 508c. So here we've got the idea of the intelligible realm on the one hand and the visible realm on the other hand. The visible realm is most often in the scholarship on ancient philosophy called the sensible realm, in the sense that it's stuff that's perceptible by the senses, rather than that it's sensible. So Plato's saying that in the same way that the sun enables us to see things, it illuminates things in the sensible realm, and then using sight we see things. In the intelligible realm, this kind of what's sometimes referred to as noumenal, it's the kind of mind realm. It's not visible, it doesn't have a physical existence. In that same way, goodness is like the sun. It illuminates the intelligible things. Using our capacity to know, we can then know things. So goodness enables the intellectual perception of things, is really what he's saying there. So he develops this theme in the allegory of the cave, which comes next. So this is an overview of the allegory of the cave. So imagine a cave. Towards kind of the back of the cave, there's a wall built in the middle of it. There's a group of people who have lived their whole lives in the cave, and they're chained to the wall, and they're facing the back of the cave. So they're facing away from the entrance to the back of the cave, chained to this wall. Behind the wall, so behind the prisoners' backs, there's a fire, and along the wall behind them, other people are walking around with objects. He's quite vague about what kind of objects, but just imagine there's these kind of various objects coming along the wall like a conveyor belt. And they cast shadows on the back of the cave. So the prisoners who are chained there can see the shadows, they watch the shadows, and they believe the shadows to be reality because they've not really ever known anything else. But then imagine somebody breaks free, gets out of the chains, walks around the cave, sees the fire, sees the objects. So at first, this person would find it hard to believe what they were seeing, and would find it hard to believe that what they were seeing was reality, whereas the shadows that they had been used to watching were just shadows. But slowly they'd become accustomed to it, and they'd venture further and further, and they might even make it out of the cave. Eventually they'd even be able to look at the sun. But, says Plato, if this person then went back into the cave to tell everyone, all the prisoners, what he or she had seen, because the person would be blinded again by the darkness as they re-entered the cave, the other prisoners would conclude that the person had been harmed, and they'd refuse to believe him. They'd say, no, I just don't, I'm going to stay here. The allegory of the cave is usually read, it's read in loads of different ways, and there's a lot of argument about the kind of political implications of the cave. I'm going to leave those aside. In a sort of strictly epistemological way, it's usually read to mean this. The world that the prisoners can see, the shadows, that's the sensible world that we inhabit. What it's imitating, the real objects and the world outside the cave, is taken to be the intelligible world. In this way, there's a kind of hierarchical relationship between the intelligible and the sensible worlds, where the sensible world is a shadowy version of the intelligible world. Sometimes people say the intelligible world is the real world. I think that's a bit of a complicated term to introduce here. I don't think there's ever a claim that the sensible world isn't real, but there's this hierarchical relationship where the intelligible world is primary and the sensible world is a reflection. So in the allegory, the person had to emerge to see the sun. As you'll remember from the analogy of the sun that I mentioned just before, the sun is the good in Plato's thinking. It's what enables us to have knowledge. So how does this all relate to the forms? So the forms are generally taken to be the things in the intelligible world. There's not a lot of clarity from Plato himself over what a form really is and what its exact relationship to the sensible world is. The forms are clearly related to the question of the relationship between individual things and universals. So that is the question of what it means for a type or class of objects to be the same object, the same kind of object, while being themselves individual particular manifestations of that type or class. So, for example, what does it mean for my cat, Carmen, who's a particular individual, and my neighbour's cat, Moon, who's a different particular individual, to both be cats? And okay, what about my friend's dog, Goose, also a particular individual, is not a cat but a dog? What's the similarity going on between Carmen and Moon that Goose does not share in? The dominant way of reading forms would say, in answer to this question, there's a form of cat, a sort of intelligible catness that I have recognition of when I see Carmen and Moon, but not when I see Goose. But it's not clear whether forms are paradigms, perfect examples, or whether it just does mean something a bit more nebulous, like the quality of catness, or even the sum total of catness across all the beings and objects in the world that are cats. There's a lot of different interpretations here, and there's a lot of grey areas. It's also not clear what Plato thinks, whether Plato thinks there should be forms for every substance or quality. For example, would he say there's a form for hole punch? Just obviously he wouldn't know about that because it postdates him. Or are the forms really only of the kind of big important things like the good and the just and human being? Unanswered. However we splice up the specifics, though, the theory of the forms is clearly powerful. In particular, three main elements. First, the intelligible sensible division. So the division between the intelligible world, which is noumenal, it doesn't have a physical existence, it's just accessed by perception and knowledge. Sorry, accessed by knowledge, not perception. And then the sensible division, the sensible world, which is kind of all around us and we perceive and we move through. Second, the idea that the intelligible realm is somehow ontologically prior to the sensible world. So the objects in the sensible world are reflections of the content of the intelligible world. And third, the idea that human beings live in the sensible world, but we have some ways of recognising or mentally engaging with the intelligible world. And all of those three things will be important when we talk throughout the rest of the lecture course about Plato's ideas about science. In next week's lecture, I'll return in a lot more detail to the question of mathematical objects, the subject of dianoia, that is, the second round down on the divided line, and I'll talk about how understanding the world as having a mathematical structure, which Plato does, how that underpins his claim that we can talk about the world in mathematical terms. For now, I'm going to move to a different model, and that's the model of Aristotle. Earlier on, I mentioned the relationship between knowledge and belief and the various different types of cognition in Plato. Aristotle also made the case that the objects of knowledge were not the same as the objects of belief. While in the Aristotelian model one can have true beliefs about something that one also has knowledge about, the two are different types of mental experience. Believing something involves the formation of a proposition or a collection of propositions, and a conviction that such a proposition is true. So that's pretty much the same as how contemporary philosophy analyses beliefs. However, knowing something for Aristotle involves knowing why something is the case. It's a demonstrative type of knowledge. And also, for him, it involves knowing how it couldn't be otherwise, sometimes referred to as intellection. For Aristotle, knowledge is grounded by reference to this stable knowledge that things can't be otherwise. And this is sometimes referred to as the theory of the indemonstrables. I'll come back to some more examples, some more specific examples, and particularly some examples of how Aristotle thinks about biological substances and kinds in following weeks. But just to give a brief flavour to make it a little bit clearer. For example, my sister and I could both hold the same true belief that our cat, Carmen, is an animal. Okay, that's a true belief. My belief is based on the fact that Carmen's furry and that she has a tail and whiskers. My sister, on the other hand, understands that Carmen's fur, tail and whiskers are all what Aristotle would call accidental properties. They're not essential to Carmen's being a cat. She'd still be, essential to her being an animal. She'd still be an animal even if she didn't have fur, a tail and whiskers. My sister instead recognises the essential properties that constitute Carmen's identity as an animal, and those are, according to Aristotle, and again I'll come back to this, that she belongs to the class of animals because she's a living being. She's got a sensitive soul, that is, she can perceive the sensible world. She's capable of locomotion, so she can move around under her own steam. She's capable of sensation and feeling, but she's not capable of thought and reflection. And for Aristotle, that's only something that humans can do. Again, I'll return to that. So if my sister were to know all of these different properties, she would have demonstrative knowledge of Carmen's being an animal. As I say, I'll come back to the specifics of that, but let's just take that for granted. So in this example, my sister understands that if Carmen had a rational soul, she wouldn't be an animal. That would make her a human. So that means that my sister has as well as having this demonstrative knowledge of what makes her what she is, she also has intellection of what Carmen makes her an animal and not, for example, a human. So she satisfies these criteria that Aristotle has for knowledge. Whereas my belief, because it's a true belief, it's true that Carmen's an animal, but it's based on these irrelevant factors. And so for Aristotle, those are just two different types of cognition. So Aristotle's theory of mind posits that human beings form beliefs through sense perception, which is then classified and sorted by logos, reason, and can form propositions about the world. Beliefs can be true, but they can't be converted to knowledge without a lot of additional information. As Lloyd Gerson puts it, and I'll put a bibliographical reference to this work later because it's very useful, there's a modal leap between belief and knowledge. I could not know that Carmen was an animal by modifying my true belief. I'd need all that great deal of extra information that my sister possessed to be able to truly know it. I mentioned in the first lecture that Aristotle doesn't talk about science as one thing per se, but he does talk, unlike Plato, he does talk quite a lot about episteme, or knowledge, in posterior analytics, using that term. So what does he mean by episteme? It's fairly certain that he means something technical and specific, and it's often translated as scientific knowledge. Here's his definition. So we have scientific knowledge of something, or we have episteme of something, when we know the cause, why the thing is, that it definitely is the cause of that, and that it cannot be otherwise. So that matches to what I've just been saying about Aristotle's example of how you have knowledge about something rather than a true belief. So that's in Posterior Analytics 1.2. As various scholars have pointed out, what this means is that for Aristotle, scientific knowledge is essentially the knowledge of causes, and also that scientific knowledge is only that which can be known necessarily. Aristotle's discussions of scientific knowledge are usually found in his works on logic, and this is because he doesn't just think of knowledge as kind of this disembodied thing. Well, disembodied it obviously is. He doesn't think of it as this kind of abstracted thing, but for him it's very much bound up in the method by which you come to knowledge, that is, by logical reasoning. When trying to use a piece of knowledge to reach a conclusion, Aristotle has quite a lot of specific rules for how that works, which conditions it has to satisfy. For example, the conditions he imposes are that it must be true, so that's fairly self-explanatory, and that's what we've been saying. It's in line with modern philosophy. To reason from something to something else, the thing you're starting from must be primary. That means it must be more epistemically available than the thing you're trying to prove. So it's no point, from my previous example, it would be no point trying to prove that Carmen's a cat before you've proved that she's a living being. The third thing is that it must be immediate. It must be amesa, without a middle. This means that it's one thing. It's not something which requires kind of intermediate steps. It must be better known or more familiar than the conclusion. That's similar to the primacy claim. And it must be prior to the conclusion. So following a method of logical deduction should, in Aristotle's view, get at the causes, the idea of the conclusion. And when you can give a full account of the causes of the conclusion, then you've got to a state of knowledge of the conclusion. So let's talk a little bit more about how Aristotle's logic works. So Aristotle's logical works are sometimes known as the organon or the instrument. That's a kind of later snarky term applied to it by the later peripatetics to imply that logic isn't properly philosophy, but rather a kind of machine which you turn the handle and stuff comes out. But it's still a term that's quite widely in use. So there's 6 logical works that Aristotle wrote, or that we have. Perhaps he wrote more. The Categories, On Interpretation, Prior Analytics, Posterior Analytics, Topics, and On Sophistical Refutations. Of those, the ones that are usually thought to be most important are prior and posterior analytics. Aristotle's logic is built around syllogisms, which you may well have some familiarity with. Basically, it's the notion of deduction, and in short, a deduction is a conclusion that results of necessity from 2 or more premises. So, X results of necessity from Y and Z if it would be impossible for X to be false when Y and Z are true. So, how does this work? Syllogisms are structures of assertions, or apophanases. Each assertion has a subject and it has a predicate. And it either affirms or it denies the predicate. So what's a predicate? A predicate is just something that can be affirmed or denied logically. Each single assertion only affirms or denies a single predicate of a single subject. So the sky is blue, the sky is the subject, blue is the predicate. The assertion, the sky is blue, is affirming the predicate blue of the subject, the sky. Aristotle treats conjunctions throughout his works as collections of assertions which don't have an intrinsic unity. So the sky is blue and the sea is blue, he would treat as just 2 separate assertions. The sky is blue, the sea is blue. It obviously gets a lot more complicated than that, but let's just leave it there for now. Subjects and predicates of assertions are known as terms, horoi. They can be individual, they refer to individual objects like Aristotle or you or France, or they can be universal, that is, they refer to non-individuals, they refer to objects that many individuals are referred to with the same term, so egg, square, town. Predicates must necessarily be universals. So the example of Socrates is bald is a valid term because the subject in this case is an individual, Socrates. The predicate, bald, is a universal. You can apply bald to many different individuals. That makes sense. Whereas Socrates is you is not a valid logical term. It doesn't really make sense. Because you are an individual and so is Socrates. Now, you might say, well, actually, isn't it useful to be able to say things like, to identify a subject as another subject? For example, for me to be able to say something like, I am Claire. Sure, that is true, but that wouldn't count as a logical term. It's a tautology, or it's something else. It's an identity relationship. It's not a term from which you can reason. You can also form assertions the wrong way round with some linguistic rejigging. So you could say something like, the object that is brown is this table. Now, linguistically, that does make sense as a thing to say. It does refer to something. But it wouldn't count as a logical term, whereas if you said this table is brown, that would count. The difference between those two formulations is as follows. So saying the object that is brown is this table is really only an accident of the way that you framed the assertion. It just happens to be the case, if you're in a room where there's no other brown objects, that what you're saying is true. Whereas if you're saying this table is brown, that's kind of a true predicate. This sounds like a silly example, but in a more abstract logic, it's possible to make this kind of mistake. Because Aristotle talks about general subjects and individual subjects in the same way, it means it's useful for him to have the categories of universal and particular. For example, for a predicate P and a subject S, you might want to affirm P in the case of all S's, or you might want to deny P, but only for some S's. There's various options here, and I've put them up on the screen here. So you can have universal affirmation, and that's all S is P, or every S is P. You can have particular affirmation, some S is P. Or you can have an indefinite affirmation, just S is P, you don't get any additional information. Similarly, with denials, you can have universal denial, so no S is P. You can have particular denial, some S is not P, or said another way, not every S is P. Or you can have indefinite denials, just S is not P, no extra information. This can be formatted quite helpfully into what is known as the square of opposition, which is going up on the screen now. The point of the square of opposition is to identify logical relationships between terms, and it's especially helpful for identifying contradictions. So for example, if you're looking at it, you can see that if you've got the universal statement, every S is P, and you've also got the particular statement, some S is not P, you've got a contradiction. So if your statement is every cat has 4 legs, but you also have a true statement that my neighbour's cat, a particular cat, does not have 4 legs, then you know that there's a contradiction here and one of those statements is wrong, is false. And then you've got what is called the relationship between subalterns and superalterns. So what this means, for example, is every S is P is the superaltern of some S is P. And reciprocally, some S is P is the subaltern of every S is P. Why is that useful? Well, you can see that if a proposition's subaltern is false, then the proposition itself must be false too. So if some S is P is false, then every S is P must also be false. So if it's false that there exists a cat with 3 legs, if that's just false, then obviously it's false that every cat has. Obviously, the statement "every cat has 3 legs" is then false. So similarly, if the superaltern is true, if you know for certain that the statement "every cat has 4 legs" is true, then the subaltern must be true, that there is some particular cat that has 4 legs. You know that must be true. The medieval and therefore traditional way of notating the universal and particular affirmations and denials is using a system of letters, and if you've done formal logic, you'll see how these are similar to some formal logic symbols. They go like this. The letter A is for all, E is for no, I is for some, and O is for some not. To make things confusing, Aristotelian logic is, from our point of view, sort of backwards, in that things in Aristotle are phrased like this: predicate A belongs to all subject B, which we understand, we turn it round usually and turn it into a proposition where we say every subject B is predicate A. There's a debate raging about whether these are actually equivalent and whether it matters, but I won't go into that. Okay, so how do you build syllogisms? Syllogisms are built up of what's called the major term and the minor term. The major term is one that includes the predicate of the conclusion, and the minor term is one that includes the subject of the conclusion. So, from that, the premise containing the major term is called the major premise, and the premise containing the minor term is called the minor premise. There are a whole range of different standard syllogisms, standard forms of syllogisms, arrangements of syllogisms, which are all given these unusual medieval names, which derive from their use of these letters A, E, O, and I to mean all, no, some not, some. A really good introduction to this is to be found on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page, the entry on Aristotle's Logic by Terence Parsons. I'd recommend that if you'd like to look at this in some more detail. I'll just talk you through two really quick examples, but there isn't time to go in any detail. So the simplest type of syllogism is its funny medieval name is Barbara. It's Barbara because if you take the vowels from the word Barbara, they're all A's, A, and so it involves 3 A terms, that is, terms that predicate Y of all X's. So let me put an example up on the screen now. So this example, in fact, the first premise of this example isn't true in real life, but let's pretend it is. So you have your major term, your major premise, rather. Your major premise is all fish are scaly. Then you have your minor premise, all herring are fish. And it's the case that if those two statements are true, then this conclusion, the third term, must also be true, and the third term is all herring are scaly. So if all fish are scaly and all herring are fish, then all herring are scaly. Obviously, that's for us quite a simple deduction, but that's the first and simplest type, Barbara. You get all sorts of different types of these things. They get much more complicated from here. Some of the more complicated ones are, so here's an example of a much more complicated one, which is known as Ferrison. Its weird medieval name is Ferrison, uses the same thing, so uses the same structure as for Barbara. So the name is derived in the same way. So the first vowel of Ferrison is E, the second vowel is I, the third vowel is O. So that tells you it's got a term, an E term, an I term, and an O term. So let me put an example of Ferrison up on the screen. So in this example, the major premise is no train is a car. The minor premise is some trains have steering wheels. Okay, and from this you can reason to the conclusion, which is that some things that have steering wheels are not cars. Again, in words it sounds very simple. Once you start doing this all in letters or all in an abstract way, it becomes quite hard to follow. So there are 256 of these standard types of syllogism, and where you have different combinations of A terms, E terms, I terms, and O terms, and there are standard sets of logical deductions you can make. So it is a very complicated system. There's various further things I could say about Aristotelian logic, but I think I'm not going to go into any of them now. I hope it gives you something of a flavour of how it works and how Aristotle uses logical, how this underpins some of his scientific argument, which we will see in later weeks. Instead, now that I've talked a bit about Plato and a bit about Aristotle, I'm going to contrast their theories of knowledge and show some bits from the skeptic tradition. In this lecture, I'll focus on the early skeptics, the Eleatic skeptics. You'll see in following weeks a bit more of why what the Eleatics say comes to be so important. It's important to note, I mentioned this at the start, but that Plato is a generation or two younger than the Eleatics. Socrates, Plato's mentor, of course, probably met Parmenides and Zeno when he was young, so Plato's just kind of out of that lifespan. Aristotle's a generation younger again, so they're within living memory, but it's certainly the case that Plato and Aristotle would have been influenced by the Eleatics. Let's begin with Parmenides. So Plato's dialogue Parmenides records the visit in about 450 BC of Parmenides and Zeno from Elea in what is now southern Italy to Athens. And it showcases their discussions with Socrates. Parmenides and Zeno were primarily interested in epistemology and cosmology, what the nature and structure of the world is like and how we can know about it. They were part of a tradition, and perhaps Parmenides was the founder of this tradition, that examined paradoxes. The core question they were interested in in maybe in opposition or maybe just in a change of direction to the theories of their predecessors, who I'll talk about next week. So their core question was, how can you know any of this? They opened up some really deep questions about epistemology and ontology, and many of the points they still raise are in different forms still debated in epistemology today. So I'll talk you through a bit of one of Parmenides' arguments. It's quite a contested thing. What we have of Parmenides is very fragmentary, quite confusing, but I think it's important and it's interesting, and it will give you a flavour of what sort of thing we're getting into for next week. And I think it's very important in general for the development of scientific thinking. So let's begin with the fragment. This fragment, bits from fragment 3 and fragment 6 of Parmenides. And so one of the things he says is, it's the same thing that can be thought that can be. By necessity, that which we can talk and think about exists. It's possible to be, and it's not possible for that which is nothing to be. It's this that I ask you to consider. So I think what's going on here is that Parmenides is posing an idea where we take epistemology to be equivalent to ontology. That is, whatever we can conceive of, that's what is. This is in effect the same type of statement as Descartes' much later cogito ergo sum, although the subject here is not oneself, but anything broadly within the scope of human reason. There's obvious problems here with this. Parmenides goes on to point them out. For example, we could conceive of the abstract notion of non-being. So in some strict sense, then, does that mean non-being exists? Well, but wait a minute, because the whole point of non-being is that it doesn't exist. One possible answer to that is to say that you can only actually truly conceive of things that are. That's to say, you think you can think of nothingness, but when you try to think of nothingness, you're not actually really thinking of nothingness. And in the same way, you might think that you can think of things coming into being, but actually you can't think of that consistently. You can't grasp the pure notion of coming into being because it's not a thing, just like you can't actually think of nothing. In another set of fragments, Parmenides elaborates on this, and he makes an argument that goes like this. Now I've put it into a kind of numbered format, which is much clearer than the form it comes in. But let's take it step by step. So, step 1, things either are or they aren't. Fairly uncontested. Step 2, nothing comes from nothing, and this later in Latin philosophy and then in medieval philosophy gets known as nihil ex nihilo. It means, I think in this case, it means something can't come from nothing. Okay, that seems fine. And also, nothing can't come from something. Nothing only begets further nothingness. So the next step is, therefore, that which is can't change state from non-being to being, or from being to non-being, because if nothing can come from nothingness, if you can only have something that either is or isn't, and you can't get something out of nothing and you can't get nothing out of something, then stuff either has to be nothing forever or it's something forever. It can't change between the two. Okay. The next step he makes is to say, okay, well, the stuff that does exist, can't have a beginning or an end because it can't have come out of nothing and it can't go back into nothing. But he says following that means it also can't have a past or a future. Now, this is a bit unintuitive to us, but if you think of time kind of experientially as change, time is to do with the change of things, then it makes more sense. And that is the sense, I think, in which many of these philosophers think of time, and we'll come back to that. So the claim is, if things can't change state from being into non-being or vice versa, they can't change at all, they just are or aren't. And if they can't change, then how can they have a past or future? They're just infinitely there. So, Parmenides says, if what is infinite and unchanging, we could also reason that it's continuous, it's indivisible, it's immovable. So I think what he's getting at here, and this is a very modern bit of language that he certainly wouldn't use, but I think what he's saying here is basically the fabric of reality hasn't got holes in it. Everything that's there is just there in one big chunk. He then goes on to reason, however, so you've got this stuff, big chunk, continuous, immovable, indivisible, doesn't change, it's just what is, it's just a chunk of what is. However, he says it can't be spatially infinite because it's immovable, it's constant in its place, and there has to be a hard boundary between being and nothingness. What is a fixed thing. It's not that everything is. It's a fixed thing, and there's nothingness beyond it. So that last bit is the weirdest bit, and I think it's fine if you don't get it. I'm not sure I entirely get it, and we can get a bit more into it next week when we talk about cosmology. But you can see the kind of deep waters we're in. So interpretations of what Parmenides was doing here have varied. Some people claim that Parmenides was a hardcore ontological monist. That is, he really was making the case that there's only one thing in the world, that which is, it's just there in a big chunk, one thing, nothing else. Now, to clarify that, I don't think anyone believes that Parmenides meant that people couldn't navigate through the physical world that we live in with its various different objects. You know, if you gave him a chair to sit down on, he wouldn't say, I can't sit down on that because it's not real, there's only one thing in the world. But his theory may well have been that the superficial reality we live in is underpinned by a true reality where there is only one huge, eternal, undifferentiated substance. You can see already some similarities with Plato's intelligible and sensible world. What's not clear from Parmenides is the relation between the world as we experience it and what he takes to be truly reality. Indeed, a particular problem in the interpretation among scholars of Parmenides has been that despite raising all these really core epistemological questions, Parmenides then goes on to set out a bunch of his own philosophical theories. Why would he do this if he was a hardcore committed skeptic who believed that we couldn't know anything truly other than what is the one thing? That's something we can come back to, but in short, many of the later skeptics faced a similar problem. So they were different from Parmenides in that they didn't even think we could know about this one underlying substance. They didn't even claim that. They really thought we couldn't know anything about the true nature of the world. However, the later skeptics did say that there were better and worse ways to navigate through the world as we experience it. And some of those involved forming, for example, physical theories. But of course, their claim was, you know, in living, you go through the world and you have these various understandings of things, but none of those are true knowledge. They're not based on real, actual knowledge of the world. So that might sound like splitting hairs to you, but that's one way I think that somebody like Parmenides might be able to retain a core skepticism or an ontological monism while also having what I'm going to broadly call normal views about the world we actually live in. So, deep waters with Parmenides. Another Eleatic philosopher who raised other but related epistemological questions was Zeno. You'll probably be familiar with some of Zeno's paradoxes. The most famous one is about a race held between Achilles and a tortoise. Here's a diagram of it on your screen. So Achilles is a fast runner, the tortoise is very slow. Let's say the tortoise is given a head start of 10 metres, they're doing a 100-metre race. Achilles should still be able to win, right? He's a fast runner. If we think about it in a certain way that Zeno advocates, it becomes very confusing though. So let's say the tortoise gets its head start, the tortoise gets to the 10-metre mark. Okay, at that point, Achilles begins running. Now, if we take the point at which Achilles gets to the 10-metre mark, the tortoise will already have moved on. Maybe not very far, maybe she's only got 1 more metre, she's very slow, but maybe, you know, she will have moved on beyond the 10-metre mark. So let's say, okay, the tortoise has got 1 metre further, she's got to the 11-metre mark. Okay, great, well, now we say Achilles runs to the 11-metre mark. It won't take him very long, he's already at 10, he just has to run to 11. But by the time Achilles has got to the 11-metre mark, Even if he gets there very quickly, the tortoise has moved on a further bit. Even if she's only moved 10 centimetres, she still moved on. Okay, well, fine, Achilles has to close that gap. Again, by the time we say Achilles has got to the 11 metre and 10 centimetre mark, the tortoise has moved on, she's moved another centimetre, and so on ad infinitum. You see how this happens. Of course, in real life, we don't think about movement divided up into these little chunks. We just think of Achilles as moving continuously, and obviously he outruns the tortoise, and obviously in real life that's what happens. But Zeno's paradox does raise an important question about how to think about chunks of time or chunks of distance. Another paradox, which is less well known, gets at the same idea but in a different way, and it's sometimes called the paradox of the arrow. So here's a diagram. So the situation is this: an archer fires an arrow at a target that's 100 metres away. For the arrow to move from the archer's bow to the target, we agree that it must move, it must change the position it occupies. Okay? However, if you consider it moment by moment, something weird happens, like in the Achilles and the tortoise paradox. So take, for example, the instant at which the arrow reaches the halfway point to the target. If we take a snapshot of that instant, say if you were able to use a camera with an incredibly quick shutter time, and you could get a snapshot with the arrow perfectly still in the middle of the air, perfectly static, we'd say, okay, well that's weird because we know it's moving, but it's static in this single moment. Okay, well let's take another moment. Let's take the moment instantly after the halfway point. Well, but then the arrow would also be static. What if you keep doing this and you end up taking a snapshot at every point at which along the arrow's motion towards the target? At every point it's static. What does that mean about motion? If at every instant the arrow is motionless and time itself is made up of all these instants, then how can the arrow ever move? This lecture has been a bit on the long side, I'm sorry about that. But I hope it's given you a bit of an insight into some epistemological theories, particularly those of Plato and Aristotle, some sense of how scientific argumentation worked, including Aristotle's logic, and then in the bit on the skeptics, some sense of the sort of questions that ancient thinkers were asking about scientific epistemology. In the next lecture, I will talk about cosmogony and cosmology, that is, accounts for the creation and the structure of the universe, and that will include plenty of pre-Socratic accounts, and it will rely on some of the material discussed today.